X-15, Flight 36597. On November 15, 1967, U.S. Air Force Major Michael J. Adams climbed into the cockpit of the X-15-3 at Edwards Air Force Base for what would be his seventh flight in the experimental rocket plane. The 37-year-old test pilot had been selected for the X-15 program based on his exceptional skills flying high-performance aircraft, and he was being considered for NASA's Astronaut Corps. The X-15 was designed to explore the boundary between atmospheric and spaceflight, reaching altitudes above 50 miles, where conventional aircraft could not operate. Adams's mission, designated Flight 3-65-97, called for him to reach an altitude of 250,000 feet while testing a new ultraviolet stellar photography experiment and evaluating the aircraft's reaction controls in the near vacuum of space. The flight plan seemed routine by X-15 standards, but several factors would combine to create a deadly situation. At 10:30 a.m., Adams's X-15 was released from the wing of a modified B-52 bomber at 45,000 feet over the Mojave Desert. He immediately ignited the XLR-99 rocket engine, which produced 57,000 pounds of thrust and accelerated the aircraft to over 3,800 miles per hour. As the X-15 climbed steeply through the atmosphere, Adams reported normal engine performance and aircraft handling. The rocket plane reached its planned altitude of 266,000 feet, officially entering space, and making Adams the first person to die during a spaceflight. However, during the high-altitude portion of the flight, something went wrong with the aircraft's attitude control system. The X-15 began an inadvertent yaw motion that Adams initially didn't recognize because the thin atmosphere at that altitude provided almost no aerodynamic feedback. The spacecraft's reaction control system, designed to provide stability in space, was not functioning properly, and Adams found himself in a slowly developing emergency that would prove fatal. As the X-15 began its descent back into the atmosphere, the yaw motion became more pronounced, causing the aircraft to enter a spin. Adams attempted to correct the problem using the aircraft's conventional aerodynamic controls, but at such high altitude and speed, they were largely ineffective. Ground controllers at Edwards Air Force Base tracked the aircraft's erratic flight path on radar and tried to provide guidance, but communications were intermittent due to the plasma sheath surrounding the hypersonic aircraft. As the X-15 descended through 200,000 feet, it began encountering thicker atmosphere, which should have allowed Adams to regain control using conventional flight controls. However, the aircraft's angle of attack had become so extreme that it was essentially flying sideways through the air at over 3,000 miles per hour. The aerodynamic forces on the aircraft were enormous and increasing rapidly as it entered denser air. At approximately 65,000 feet altitude while traveling at Mach 3.5, the X-15 encountered G-forces that exceeded the structural limits of both the aircraft and the human body. The aircraft began to break apart under the extreme aerodynamic loads, with pieces separating from the main fuselage. Adams, subjected to forces exceeding 15 Gs, likely lost consciousness before the aircraft's final breakup. The main wreckage of the X-15-3 impacted the ground near Johannesburg, California, creating a crater several feet deep. Adams's body was found still strapped into his ejection seat, but the seat had never been activated. Investigation revealed that the aircraft's adaptive flight control system had malfunctioned during the high-altitude portion of the flight, initiating the yaw motion that Adams was unable to correct. The tragedy led to improvements in pilot training for high-altitude flight and better backup control systems for spacecraft operating at the edge of the atmosphere. Major Michael J. Adams was posthumously awarded astronaut wings for his flight, becoming the first person to earn them by dying in space. Vladimir Komarov, Soyuz 1. On April 22, 1967, Vladimir Komarov walked through the corridors of the Baikonur Cosmodrome, knowing he was likely walking to his death. The 40-year-old Soviet cosmonaut had been selected to pilot Soyuz 1, the first crewed flight of the Soviet Union's new spacecraft designed to outpace America's Apollo program. But Komarov knew what his superiors were hiding from the public. His friend and fellow cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had desperately tried to convince mission planners to delay the flight. Over 200 technical problems had been identified in the Soyuz spacecraft during pre-flight testing, including critical failures in the parachute system, unstable attitude control, and faulty heat shield bonding. Soviet engineers had submitted report after report documenting these dangerous defects, but political pressure from the Kremlin overruled safety concerns. The mission was scheduled to coincide with Lenin's birthday and the May Day parade, giving Communist Party leaders a propaganda victory they desperately needed. Komarov understood the impossible situation. If he refused to fly, his backup pilot, Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space and a Soviet hero, would take his place. Komarov couldn't let his friend die in a spacecraft he knew was defective. At 3:35 a.m. Moscow time on April 23rd, Soyuz 1 lifted off from Baikonur into the pre-dawn darkness. The problems began almost immediately. One of the spacecraft's 2 solar panels failed to deploy properly, cutting power generation in half and making it impossible to properly orient the craft toward the sun. Without adequate solar panel positioning, the spacecraft's batteries began draining rapidly. The ion sensors that controlled the craft's attitude became unreliable, causing Soyuz 1 to tumble uncontrollably through space. Komarov fought to stabilize his ship manually, using precious fuel reserves to fire the attitude control thrusters. Ground control monitored the mounting problems with growing alarm. The planned rendezvous with Soyuz 2, which was supposed to launch the next day with 3 cosmonauts aboard, was immediately canceled. After 18 increasingly desperate orbits, Mission Control ordered Komarov to attempt an emergency re-entry over the Soviet Union. As Soyuz 1 began its descent on April 24th, Komarov manually oriented his spacecraft for re-entry, knowing his life depended on systems that had already proven unreliable. The descent through the upper atmosphere proceeded normally at first, with the heat shield protecting the crew compartment as designed. But as the spacecraft slowed to subsonic speeds at an altitude of 23,000 feet, the main parachute container failed to open properly due to a design flaw that engineers had identified months earlier. The parachute became tangled within its container, providing virtually no drag to slow the spacecraft's descent. Komarov deployed the backup parachute system, but it immediately became twisted with the partially deployed main chute and the drogue parachute, creating a tangled mess that was completely ineffective. Soviet listening posts on the ground recorded Komarov's final transmissions as he plummeted toward Earth at over 250 miles per hour. He cursed the engineers and officials who had forced him to fly in a defective spacecraft, knowing he had less than a minute to live. At 7:24 a.m., Soyuz 1 struck the ground near Orenburg with tremendous force, creating a crater and instantly igniting the spacecraft's remaining fuel. The impact was so violent that the spherical descent module was completely flattened into a disk barely a meter high. Komarov's body was burned beyond recognition, fused to the twisted metal of his spacecraft. It took recovery teams hours to separate his remains from the wreckage. His death forced a complete overhaul of the Soviet space program, delaying crewed flights for 18 months while engineers redesigned the parachute system and addressed hundreds of other safety issues that political pressure had forced them to ignore.